Psychedelics are illegal not because a loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally lay down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong.
The psychedelic experience is as central to understanding your humanness as having sex, or having a child, or having responsibilities, or having hopes and dreams, and yet it is illegal. We are somehow told we are infantilized. We're told, you can wander around within the sanctioned playpen of ordinary consciousness, and we have some intoxicants over here if you want to mess yourself up. We've got some scotch here and some tobacco and red meat and some sugar and a little TV and so forth and so on. But these boundary-dissolving hallucinogens that give you a sense of unity with your fellow man and nature are somehow forbidden. This is an outrage.
As soon as he put headphones on my head, the entire universe began dancing to music.
It's a sign of cultural immaturity, and the fact that we tolerate it is a sign that we are living in a society as oppressed as any society in the past.
Because a loving government is concerned that you may jump out of a third-story window. Psychedelics are illegal because they dissolve opinion structures and culturally lay down models of behavior and information processing. They open you up to the possibility that everything you know is wrong.
Drugs is a word which has polluted the well of language. Part of the reason we have a drug problem is because we don't have an intelligent language to talk about substances, plants, psychedelic states of mind, sedative states of mind, states of amphetamine excitation. We can't make sense of the problem and the opportunities offered by substances unless we clean up our language. Drugs is a word that's been used by governments to make it impossible to think creatively about the problem of substances and abuse and availability and so forth and so on. It's a kind of a paradox, isn't it? Drugs mean that which cures us and the greatest social problem of the generation. So there, right there, you see the schizophrenia involved in thinking about drugs. Apparently there are good drugs sanctioned by science and medicine, and bad drugs used by brown people in strange rites and growing in unusual plants in distant parts of the world. This kind of thinking, because it's naive, leads, of course, to social problems and bad politics and bad social policy. From the time I was very young, I was fascinated with the idea of extremely dramatic changes in consciousness from which one recovers after a few hours, induced by plants. And I discovered through the writing of Aldous Huxley and other people that this was a worldwide religious and cultural phenomenon that my own Catholic middle-class upbringing had completely overlooked and denied, and I've been fascinated with it ever since. You know, it's a bit like sexuality. It's something which the Calvinist intellect would just prefer didn't exist, but in fact the phenomenon of being human beings in animal bodies with a relationship to nature makes it important for us to address these altered states of consciousness and the plants, the substances, and the cultural institutions that come into being around these things. To my mind, human history is the story of one substance after another distorting or transforming human values and society. A perfect example would be sugar. Most people don't even think of sugar as a drug, and yet we may think cocaine distorted moral and political values in Latin America, but sugar brought back slavery. Slavery actually died with the Roman Empire. Nobody worked agricultural products with slaves in the Middle Ages. It wasn't until the early 1400s that the Portuguese began producing sugar, and they used up Jews and prisoners. And so then they started buying human beings from Arab traders. And the Pope was in on the deal, and everybody was in on the deal. I mean, this is drug corruption of the central institutions of society on a massive scale. Every society chooses a small number of substances, no matter how toxic, and enshrines them in its cultural values, then demonizes all other substances, and uses and then persecutes and launches witch hunts against those users whenever some political pretext requires witch hunts and persecutions. So it's an old game, and it's been played in many places. Hopefully, part of the advancement of society toward ideas of universal human rights and that sort of thing, it certainly must include the idea of the universal human right to take responsibility for and to alter your own state of consciousness as you see fit. I don't think we can even pretend that we are on the edge of a civilized dialogue until we grant that people's minds, like their bodies, must be a domain free from government control. In American law, we have the notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If the pursuit of happiness means anything, it must mean the right to use and experiment with substances and plants.
But do we need, say, more research, or do we know all we need to know about entheogens or hallucinogens?
No, we need endless amounts of research. The fact that these things have been illegal in most countries for 50 years means there is a huge lag in understanding the impact of these things on human beings. How many people have taken MDMA, and yet MDMA has not been thoroughly studied by science? How many people have smoked DMT? Same thing. In a way, by making these drugs illegal, we're setting ourselves up for a potential catastrophe someday when some side effect is overlooked because the drugs were not rationally reviewed with an eye not toward keeping them out of the hands of the public, but with an eye toward public safety and educating the public in safe use of these things. The state should not, in the matter of drugs, any more than in the matter of sex, act as the secret agent for the agenda of the church. And that's what's happening. People want to stimulate themselves. They want to explore their consciousness. They want to sedate themselves. Who are we to stand in their way with a moral ideology and the long, heavy arm of the law to interfere with that? It distorts civilized values. But that's the bottom line. Drug repression distorts civilized values and political discourse. Anyone who has actually been around people using psychedelics know they have tremendous therapeutic potential, tremendous potential to launch people into confrontations with aspects of their personality or their history that they are in denial of. The people who hold that these psychedelic substances have no application have very little actual personal experience with them. It's the old story of my mind is made up, don't confuse me with facts. I think it's a great tragedy of 20th century science that the original excitement about exploring consciousness and mental illness generated by the discovery of LSD gave way to establishment paranoia and repression of drug-using populations. The excitement in psychology when LSD was first introduced was like the excitement in the physics community when the atom was smashed, and everybody thought, well, now we'll understand mental illness, schizophrenia, the memory, so forth and so on. And instead, the government lost its nerve because it saw that these substances have a potential for deprogramming people to institutional values. And that was so terrifying that all the promise for mental illness and creativity studies and so forth and so on was sacrificed to institutional paranoia about the fact that drugs might actually cause people to wake up to some of the abuses and scams that were being run by late modernism and capitalism.
Take it easy, dude, but take it. What we call history is the fall out of a dynamic here and now feeling-toned relationship with our environment and into, this anticipation of the future, worry about the past, basically ego. And I recently spoke in New York, and New York is a very nuts and bolts kind of town. And people there took issue with the notion that all of our problems can be boiled down to a single problem. If you trace the thread of every screw-up back into the maze, it all comes back to a single issue, which is excess of ego. We all have excess of ego. And our entire situation, legalistic, psychological, religious, everything is about this, that it doesn't work. It's maladaptive, and yet we have it. And why do we have it if it's maladaptive? If it doesn't promote human values, then how in the hell did it get started, and what is it that's maintaining and sustaining it? Well, this is what I want to talk about over the course of the weekend. When I pushed the analysis of what the psychedelic experience meant to the limits, I was surprised to discover that it left the domain of my personal relationship to the mystery. What is it? What does it want from me? What is it trying to say? All that had to also make room for another issue, which is there's a political issue here. I think most people in this room, most people who have had the psychedelic experience will agree that the most profound, the most open-hearted, the most moving moments of their lives, some of them have been tied in with those experiences. But we seem unable or unwilling or afraid to extrapolate that conclusion to the notion that this is a general panacea for society, because we cannot conceive that that the solution to a spiritual dilemma could lie in matter. In other words, we ourselves have been infected by the inside-outside matter-spirit dichotomies of the dominator culture. But the notion that man, notice the gender thrust here, the notion that man could somehow bootstrap himself to Godhead without reference to nature seems to me highly peculiar and simply nothing more than an expression of hubris, pride, a belief, that we can do it our way and alone. So all of this is very the shelf life is short on all of these issues
because the planet is in a state of terminal crisis. Does that have anything to do with the psychedelic experience, or are these separate issues? How can they be separate issues if the psychedelic experience is a mirror of the state of the individual and collective psyche, and if the planet is on a collision course with some kind of terminal crisis? It seems to me then that nature is struggling to right this disequilibrated planetary ecosystem. So in a sense, there is nothing to be done except to watch and wait. But on the other hand, we are not apart from nature. We are, in some sense, a portion of nature which is the most reactive and energetic, because we are reactive and energetic in the domain of epigenetic codes. We can foment rapid change. Until recently, it was a truism of thinking about society that all change had to be gradual. This myth has now been exploded. We know that, you just take them all out and hang them, and then that's not gradual, and then you've got a new world. And this has been done in several places with excellent success recently. So change need not be gradual. And in fact, I think we're entering into a historical domain where very little change will be gradual. Gradual change was a luxury of the past.
Radical freedom. Radical freedom. Radical freedom doesn't mean giving somebody the vote. Radical freedom means the right to take over and control our own destiny and the destiny of this planet. Radical freedom means recovering our birthright. What would you think if somebody attempted to take your sexuality away from you? In the suppression of the psychedelic experience, the masters who make the rules have taken away a major slice of what it is to be a human being. This is intolerable. We have been robbed of our birthright by the frightened, the constipated, the narrow-minded, the stupid, and the afraid. Afraid, 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 afraid. Your mind. Take back your mind. That is the message. We all talk about psychedelics, the impact on ourselves, the individual experience. But what are they when you look at 1 million psychedelic trips? What does it do to society? What it does is it dissolves boundaries. It dissolves the ultimate boundary, which is the ultimate fuck-up, which is ego. Ego is something invented by frightened people 20,000 years ago as a way to suppress women, as a way to suppress sexuality, as a way to suppress the wonder inherent in the world. Psychedelics are catalysts for the human imagination. entire universe of matter is the womb of mind. And it is the task of human beings to lead the collectivity of humanity out of the labyrinth of matter and into the realm of the imagination. Direct experience, your opinion, your feelings, your sexuality is the only real thing in your universe. This is why psychedelics are illegal. They don't care whether people jump out of windows or any of that. They're not interested in public health. They do not want people to take back their minds. And we're going to take back our minds. World consequences because an empowered individual in touch with their own existential core can do what that guy did with the 18 tanks. It was an idea that stopped the tanks, and it was an idea expressed not over state radio, not through the newspapers, but by one person taking a stand. The mushrooms once said to me, you must have a plan. If you don't have a plan, you will become part of somebody else's plan.
Well, first of all, let me comment on the Buddhist thing. I'm not that friendly to that formulation because it still is postponing gratification. It's saying death is the bouquet of life, you should live toward death. I would say the bouquet of life is this moment. But to the more important point of longevity, I certainly am not interested in living forever, whatever that might mean, because I suspect if you live forever, you miss the point. In other words, I think you miss the bouquet. On the other hand, I don't see anything wrong with, well, no, that's too much to say. The only problem I have with living past whatever, 70 is you do get into political issues of, are people buying time at the expense of somebody else? One of the weirdest things about this culture is we've invented a sin for which there is no name. It's so beyond most people's ability to conceive. And this sin that we've invented is we steal the future from our children. You know, we do it with our medical health care plans where we know that all this fine surgery and stuff that you're getting is at the expense of the next generation of people. We overuse resources, leaving nothing for future generations. I don't know how that would all be sorted out. I am attracted by the idea of living as long as I want to live. I wonder how long that would be. And of course, if you make people comfortable, probably they would like to live a lot longer. What reason is there for a person to check out of a comfortable situation? In a sense, what nature does is make the body a less and less comfortable place to be, until finally you just say, all right already, you know. Beam me up, Scotty. But then, you know, the other possibility is, what if there were forms of existence that were dematerialized? How would we feel about going into circuitry for a few rounds of eternity? And what are the moral implications of that? I don't know. I've had this argument with Robert Anton Wilson. He's a big enthusiast for life extension. It depends on what you think death is. And I've managed to talk myself into the idea that death is probably not simply dissolution and chaos, not because I have received any guidance from on high, but just as I observe nature, she has a wonderful parsimoniousness about her behavior. And clearly this form, which is basically an unraveled DNA molecule that is now making a lot of claims on resources in the environment in order to keep this body going, nature put a lot of effort into this. And I think that the best model for what life is, based not on religious thinking but on biological thinking, is life is what you get when a hyperdimensional object protrudes into ordinary space. In other words, if we take this cup and cut it in two, it doesn't change. It just becomes a cup in two pieces. But it doesn't bleed, it doesn't rot, it doesn't lose its essence. If we take any living being, from a bacterium to a brontosaur, and cut it in two, the entire system falls apart very quickly, and we've created a mess, and we see that the thing that we had is no longer there. So I think what biology is the intrusion into three-dimensional space and time of hyperdimensional objects. And the other clue to that seems an argument for it, is that we do have this thing called a mind, but we can't find it anywhere. It doesn't seem to be anywhere. Even when you get down to the level of electrodes in the brain and saying words to people and watching oscilloscopes, you still can't seem to quite nail it down. So I think probably these objects retract back into hyperspace, higher space, and that this is what the soul is. The soul is there is something to this idea of a morphogenetic field, and we clothe ourselves in matter, but we are not matter. And so to actually complete a human cycle of existence, you have to go into death. It's where you came from, in some sense. I mean, we put a lot of attention into death. We don't look very much at birth. We think we understand it. I mean, we all know the story about the sperm and the egg and all that. But before that, what is going on? You know, whence cometh these forms? We seem to have the matter down pretty good. But really what a being is the intrusion into space-time of a form, and the form is unique, and then it retreats. I think it would be one of the great jokes of human history if here at the end of the 20th century, at the end of the millennium, with all this techno hypola surging around us, if we were to actually gain insight into the after-death state, And one of the reasons I'm so keen for DMT is because when I have given it to people who were purported experts in the after-death state, Tibetan lamas and shamans and this sort of thing, they come back and they say, yep, that's the territory, all right. And so in my highest states, I have had the insight, which I will convey to you without saying it's true, that this is the most limited form of existence you will ever know. You can't be deader than this. This is the bottom line. And so the good news is it's only up from here. But of course you have to bet the farm on this cheerful rap. And there's no whining if you're wrong. This is an all or nothing bet, and so naturally it brings your heart into your throat. But that's the kind of enterprise life is. All risk and the race to the swift, I think. One last. Well, I don't know. And I wonder what I will think as I approach the great divide. It's easy in the pink of health to speculate and play the philosophe and all that nonsense. But, you know, the last dance you dance alone, and nobody will be watching. But I have seen people die, and it is an inspiration. I hope to have that equanimity of mind. The other thing about death that needs to be said is we all imagine, I think, that we will have a leisurely philosophical death. That's what we all want, you know. Months to get used to the idea, to say goodbye, to gather friends, to make our bequeathments, to speak our final wisdom, and, you know. But death for most people comes messily and unexpectedly. And so I don't think you should live in an anticipation of the drama of your deathbed scene. Better to repair to the moment. You know, being a realist primarily, what I find always waiting when I return from these flights of philosophical fancy and imagination is my body, my history, my space, my time, and these things are all good. It's a great space, a great time, a great body, a great being to be. So the real message of the psychedelic experience and of the anti-historical thrust of the critique we've been carrying out here is to take the moment, the felt presence of immediate experience. This is all you know, it's all you will ever know. Everything else comes as unconfirmed rumor, innuendo, unrealized possibility, fading memory, conjecture, lie, hope, who knows. But in the moment of being, we have the completion of being. It is always complete, every moment. And to the degree that we force ourselves to look beyond it or cannot find ourselves within it, we betray it. And then we have more work to do.
Well, in 15 minutes to try and say something about shamanism and hallucinogens, we're just going to touch the surface. And I figure the simplest way to do this is just to sort of unload on you how I see these things. Shamanism is not some obscure concern of cultural anthropologists. Shamanism is how religion was practiced for its first 1,000,000 years. Up until about 12,000 years ago, there was no other form of religion on this planet. That was how people attained some kind of access to the sacred. And so shamanism then becomes about technique. And if any of you are students of the literature of shamanism, you probably know that one of the great overviews of shamanism is contained in Mircea Eliade's book, Shamanism, The Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. The Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. In other words, shamanism is not so much a religion as ordinarily conceived as it is a kind of pre-rational science, a kind of methodology for attaining a certain kind of experience. And then the question becomes, what experience and what's so great about it? Well, the experience that is attained, if we can attempt to rise to some kind of cosmic overview so that we are not dealing with the experience in the context of what the Mazatecs say or the Witoto or some other tribal people, but when we attempt to pool all of this descriptive data, then what is the experience that the shaman is having that is making him or her an exemplar in their own society, and in a sense, almost superhuman? Well, if you analyze thousands and thousands of these shamanic experiences, both both plant-induced and non-plant-induced, the overwhelming connecting thread is boundary dissolution. This is what the experience is that we are all seeking, that we call terrifying, wonderful, desirable, horrible. But what it is it's the experience of having the roof fall in and the floor fall out, all at once. Boundary dissolution. Why should that be so important, so wonderful? Because it acts psychologically in the human being like a birth experience. The world is made new. Everything is seen through newly opened eyes. Now, there are many techniques of shamanism for attaining this state. Celibacy, withholding food, ordeals, flagellation, mutilation. Doesn't sound like a program for a lot of fun, does it? And then hallucinogenic plants. Now, it's a question which always emerges at these conferences. All of you people are talking about drugs and plant substances. Isn't there another way to do this? Isn't this what the great yogic systems, the great tantric systems of thought have opened up for us without the self-polluting act of ingesting a plant into our bodies and polluting our precious bodily essences? The answer is no. No. And the further answer is the reason the universe is constructed this way is that so you will be forced to humble yourself into the admission that you can't do it alone. Why should you be able to do it alone? Where is it writ in adamantine that Joe Blow should be able to walk directly into the antechamber of the Most High simply because he or she wants to? Nowhere. The sine qua non, fancy Latin for you can't get along without it, the sine qua non for attaining a psychedelic experience is humbling yourself to the point where you admit that you must submit to the experience of the plant or the drug. This act of surrender is the major technical function you will be called upon to perform during the psychedelic trip. You just keep saying, take me, I'm yours. Take me, I'm yours. And it will do the rest. Well, this is much too much to get into in 15 minutes. But why the tension between boundary and boundary dissolution? Why the tension between the
closed personal world of reinforced neurotic constructs that we call ordinary psychological health? Why the tension between that and this vastly expanded and open state of being where life, Tao, seems to flow through us? Well, the tension between these states has to do, I think, with the fact that there is a blind spot in the human mind. We do not like to have called to our attention the animate and caring nature of the universe, because the universe is something that we have had to fight our way through to get to our present position. I mean, how many reindeer bit the dust that we could sit here this morning? How many forests were cleared? You see, we have a long history of resistance and conquest to nature, and when we experience the boundary-dissolving qualities of the hallucinogen, we learn what Pogo learned. We have met the enemy, and he is us. And closing that loop then creates a dimension of moral responsibility. And this is why the shaman is a special person, because the shaman has somehow closed the loop of moral responsibility, and in so doing becomes tremendously authentic to the people in the society that is constellated around the shaman. The shaman basically is an exemplar, a model for how to be, not simply how to be in the psychedelic or the trance state, but how to be in the act of wooing, how to be in the act of hunting, child rearing, so forth. It's a kind of exemplar that bursts through cultural conditioning. Cultural conditioning is like bad software. It's over and over, it's diddled with and rewritten so that it can just run on the next attempt. But there is cultural hardware, and it's that cultural hardware, otherwise known as authentic being, that we are propelled toward by the example of the shaman and the techniques of the shaman. You know, if someone tells you that vast spiritual riches await you if you will but give up sex, interesting food, and your own thoughts for 10 or 15 years and follow along with them, then something will be attained. This is no challenge to most of us, because we have our lives to lead, mortgages to pay, children to feed, car payments. But if someone tells you, eat this plant and you will come into your birthright, that's a real existential challenge. The excuse that it's difficult or unattainable has been removed. There can no longer be shilly-shallying around that issue. Shamanism, therefore, is a call to authenticity. Well, then the last point that I want to make, this authenticity is generally presented and has generally been presented throughout the evolution of the psychedelic movement in the United States as a kind of personal integrity, a kind of psychological health, as though you had confronted all your demons and slain them, and you are now balanced or individuated or whole or something like that. That's true. That is the first stage of the shamanic integration. But that is not the goal of the shamanic integration. Otherwise, it just becomes a kind of chemically assisted psychotherapy. The goal is then, having attained that balance, that wisdom, that connection, to then rise up to a level of universal meaning. In other words, to break through the machinery of cultural conditioning in the same way that the shaman does, and to attempt to discover something authentic outside the self-generated language cloud. And to my mind, what this authentic thing is it's hard to know how to put it, but it's the animate quality that resides within the psychedelic experience, that the universal mind is alive, is sentient, is perceiving, is there to meet you when you come through from the other side. So we're not talking about psychedelics as a spotlight to be turned on to reveal the detritus of our own personal unconscious. It is not a spotlight. It is not shining from behind you. It is shining ahead of you. It is actually that the same organizational principles which called us forth into self-reflection have called forth self-reflection out of the planet itself. And the problem then is for us to suspect this, act on our suspicion, and be good detectives and track down the spirit in its lair. And this is what shamans are doing. They are hunters of spirit. Now, anthropology tends to want to, well, place in a museum diorama is too harsh a phrase, but wants to freeze these things in context so they become artifacts. So then we say, well, how do the Witoto think about the shaman? And I've even seen papers, what do the Witoto think of the shaman in winter? What do the Witoto think of the shaman in summer? Well, not only is this a stupid question on the face of it, but since they don't have winter and summer, it's a stupid question beneath the surface. Shamanism does not exist in the same way that other culture-bound institutions exist for us to catalog and reflect on. Rather, this is a case where we played the role of the prodigal son, the descent into physis, the descent into matter. For 15,000 years we have wandered to a desert, and we are now very well adapted to the deserts of rationalism, materialism, state politics, patriarchy, so forth and so on. But there is no food in a desert. Eventually, there has to be a promised land. And I believe that many people in this room know that personally, that promised land is the psychedelic experience. The larger challenge, and it is a larger challenge, it's easy to fix your own mind. The larger challenge is to somehow make this private doorway a public option. Empower ourselves to speak of this in such a way that it cannot be put down. It cannot be rolled over. It cannot be pigeonholed. It cannot be handed over to a clique of experts, but rather it has to be confronted as the authentic thing which we lost so long ago that we no longer have any image of the thing lost. We simply have an ache that cannot be gotten rid of. The solution to this is a re-empowering of the shamanic meme, a taking of the idea of shamanism, pouring it into the best our own self-exploration has given to us, which to my mind means art, psychotherapy, and art, and to try to empower these institutions to give back our authenticity that was lost. The cultures that possess shamanism function, the entire culture, as a shamanic model for those of us who wander in the prodigal's desert
of materialism. And through the work of people like Gordon Wasson and Richard Evans Schultes, and in the 19th century Richard Spruce, the tools have been cataloged, the magical plants. And I don't believe that shamanism without hallucinogens is authentic shamanism or comfortable shamanism. Now, this is a great debate in anthropology. Merciliade on one side saying, when shamanism turns to narcotics, it has entered a decadent and final phase. The very use of the word narcotics betrays such a botanical naivete that you know you're not going to be happy with what follows. Wasson, on the other hand, said a shamanism that does not resort to hallucinogenic plants is a shamanism that has lost its roots. A shamanism that relies on ordeals, pathological personalities, and withholding of food is a shamanism that has lost a sense of its techniques and its efficacy. So the last thought I would like to leave with you is, and I hope I'm preaching to the converted, but if there's a single person in this room who doesn't know what I'm about to say, then it's worth repeating. And that is, we are not bullshitting you. This is not yoga. This is not NLP, not to knock those things. This is real. It is so real that you can take the most hardened, rational, reductionist asshole and drop him into that environment, and he will meet his maker. You know, it dissolves you. It dissolves you into a confrontation with authentic being. And this is what we are starving for. This is how we've gotten into the messes and mess that we're in. Take seriously the techniques of shamanism. Study the plants. Make real choices. And then don't diddle the dose. Once you've done your homework, go for it. Say what has never been said, to see what has never been seen, to draw, paint, sing, sculpt, dance, and act what has never before been done, to push the envelope of creativity and language. And what's really important is, I call it the self-presence of direct experience, which is a fancy term which just simply means we have to stop consuming our culture. We have to create culture. Don't watch TV. Don't read magazines. Don't even listen to NPR. Create your own roadshow. The nexus of space and time where you are now is the most immediate sector of your universe. And if you're worrying about Michael Jackson or Bill Clinton or somebody else, then you are disempowered. You're giving it all away to icons which are maintained by an electronic media, so that if you want to dress like X or have lips like Y or something, this is shit-brained, this kind of thinking. That is all cultural diversion, and what is real is you and your friends and your associations, your highs, your orgasms, your hopes, your plans, your fears. And we're told, no, we're unimportant, we're peripheral, get a degree, get a job, get a this, get a that, and then you're a player. You don't even want to play that game. You want to reclaim your mind and get it out being manufactured out of the bones of a dying world. Where is that at?
Exterior changes on the surface of the octopus are a direct readout of its state of mind. It wears its mind on its surface. And you may not know, but at the third gastrulation of the blastopore in the human fetus, it becomes the surface of the body. The surface of the body is brain tissue, essentially, a very thin sheet of brain tissue all over the outside of the body. That's why there's so many nerves in the skin. So what seems to be being preached in the DMT encounter is the ontological transformation into a telepathic mode. Now, you may have thought telepathy was you hearing somebody else think. Apparently, that's not what telepathy is. Telepathy is you seeing what somebody else means. It's the visual acquisition of meaning rather than the audio acquisition of meaning, because there is no ambiguity. You see, we use local languages. If your dictionary matches my dictionary, you can understand me. And that's fine if we're saying, could you close the door or get me a grant? But if what we're saying, if we're talking about the ontology of language or the political obligations to the community in the light of the inevitability of mortality or something like that, then acoustically transduced sound and common dictionaries don't cut the mustard. One of the most uncool things you can say in any situation is, would you please explain to me what I just said? Because that rends the fabric, and we're then faced in the mud of the fact that nobody understands or even bothers to listen to anybody else, and if they do, they don't get it anyway. My daughter, who I haven't seen for a while, is coming today, and it caused me to think of an incident that happened to she and I years ago here at Esalen. And it's a story which makes no sense whatsoever, but it really, truly happened, as far as I can tell. But it has all the qualities that bedevil this kind of thing. And what it was I was, as I am now, scholar in residence. It must have been some 10 years or so, 8 years or so ago. So Clea would have been like 9, and I would have been 40. So we were both younger and more naive. And it was dinner time at the lodge, and it was this time of year and this time of weather. And the fog had been coming all day in and out in the garden. And it was, and we genuflect here, God love him, to Carlos Castaneda, it was that very strange time of day, which only lasts a few minutes between daytime and nighttime, the crack between the world, I believe. It's interesting in South America and also in Hawaii, at precisely that moment, every day, there are certain species of Lepidoptera that rearrange themselves. In other words, that come out from wherever they've been hiding for 24 hours, fly around furiously for 5 minutes, and then disappear again for 24 hours. But anyway, it was precisely that time of day, and the fog was coming in and out of the garden, and we were not in a mood for anything peculiar. We were intent on dinner, and we were walking the path through the garden, and suddenly, as this fog moved and cleared, coming down one of the rows was a bunny, a small rabbit, except that it had very small, short horns.
Now, some of you may know the creature called the jackalope. The jackalope is a large jackrabbit with a pair of antelope horns, and it is a creature known only to exist above certain low-class bars scattered across California and Oregon. It's up on the wall, the jackalope. It's something you kid tourists with. As far as I could see, this was a baby jackalope about this high, and it crossed the trail no more than 5 feet in front of us. We both saw it, and our attitude was not amazement or an awareness that we were entering into a paranormal dimension. Both of us, I think our reaction was, come on. And then immediately behind it was a man, a very thin, not particularly healthy looking man with a shaved head, wearing something like a gray running suit. And he was running crouched. He was with his hands out like this. He was trying to catch the jack-a-bunny. And when he saw us, he appeared very confused and stood up and turned and walked the other way. And I just took her by the elbow and I said, let's get out of here. And then we went to dinner, and we've talked about it immediately after and since. And as far as anybody can reasonably and decently tell, this is the straight story on what happened. Well, it doesn't make any sense. First of all, the earth doesn't move from its pinions. But what does it say? It says that attention falling into a certain place of non-attention is set up for something like this to happen. And I can't explain it. I don't think it's explainable. It's sort of like, when you study quantum physics and they tell you that a black hole mostly puts out electrons, but the theory allows that it could eject Miatas and grand pianos, except that it would be very rare for it to eject a grand piano. But the theory does not preclude the ejection of grand pianos. So it's something like that, or it's a group hallucination, or it's a bewitchment, or, and it begins to proliferate. I was thinking about it last night or this morning, because I was in that place where I saw it happen. I was thinking, maybe Esalen lasts a really long time. Like maybe it's sort of like the Piazza San Marco in Venice, or the Central Aryan Stonehenge. Maybe we're actually starting something here that will last so long that for the next 5,000 years, people will relate to the Esalen Garden, and that somehow it's a nexus for others on strange missions. Now, the other thing about that story that I like, or that relieved me, is I guess the way to put it, is notice that it's absurd. And by being absurd, it's self-canceling. Suppose instead of a jackalope, which is an absurd creature to begin with, suppose it had been a gray of the wraparound eye type that are apparently trading high technology to the government for human fetal tissue, those people, then you would have had a real dilemma on your hands, because grays are objects of cultural fascination. In other words, if you see a gray, you just become part of a statistical body of people who've seen one. And so it's like more problematic. It's not that it's a non-reality, it's that it's a sort of a non-reality. This is, I think, part of the clue to understanding alien abductions and the way we generate information. If I tell you that I was up late last night and couldn't sleep and walked along the cliffs over Esalen, and that I encountered a shining disk, and that I then had my navel lint was removed by a team of extraterrestrial cosmetologists. This is evidence for an already existing body of data. If you say, well, you should call MUFON, they'd be very interested in this, or you should call somebody else. If I tell you I was restless last night and walked the cliffs of Esalen, and that I encountered Bugs Bunny in the company of Patrick Swayze, people will just say, you're nuts. You know, it's not sanctioned. It's not allowed. And nobody gives a hoot or takes it seriously for a moment because it serves no one's agenda. It's just insane data and should be immediately tossed out. This shows us, that the objects in the unconscious are given different weights. And you can tell a crazy story and join a self-help group. But if your story is too crazy, they won't have a group for you. They'll have a cell for you. So it's worth bearing in mind. Let's be generous here. Someone had prepared a bunny with horns to surprise someone else with whom they'd had a lifelong running joke about jackalopes. And they had arrived at Esalen for the surprise birthday party of this person and realized that the bunny was frantic because it hadn't eaten on the long trip. So they took the jack-a-bunny in its cage down to the garden to steal some lettuce for it. And in the fog and in the effort not to be seen, the bunny escaped with its horns in place, and this person, who probably didn't have a gate pass anyway, could see the whole situation getting out of hand and was frantically trying to capture the horned bunny and get it back in its... See people say, gee, what a party pooper this guy is. Well, yeah, but we're trying to save the laws of physics and reason here.
The way in which perhaps by sharing our experiences, we can begin to satisfy ourselves that the domain we journey to and from is not merely mental. And the way in which we confirm for ourselves that it is not merely mental is in the observation of disturbances in this world that we call coincidental or synchronistic or something like that. Now, this is elusive, anecdotal kind of stuff, but nevertheless, there's enough of it that I think there is something there. What do I mean? What am I talking about? Well, as an example, I have lived 42 years. Only twice in my life have packages of matches burst into flame in my pocket. In each case, it was about 4 or 5 minutes before I turned somebody on to DMT. Well, now, yes, an interesting coincidence, totally non sequitur sort of thing, but twice in my life, packages of matches have burst into flames in my pockets. Other things, many people who experiment with mushrooms report it's almost achieved anecdotal status now, the scurryings and rustlings on the periphery. And when you do mushrooms fairly frequently, you get with this to the point where you just say, oh, that's the rats in the walls, the scratcher from hyperspace, whatever it is, because it's, you can't wrap your mind around it, but it's always there. And then less easily confirmed and communicated, but I'm sure we all have had this experience, is you will take a voyage into another dimension, be completely laid out on the floor for a long, long time, and then sit up. And at the moment that you sit up, the fire flares up, the logs fall through the grate, the coals burst into flame. In other words, there is a wave of regenerative activity that sweeps through the whole system. And people report playing with clouds. People report that after intense experiences, their lives are haunted by synchronicity. Well, psychologists get rid of this kind of anecdotal material with all kinds of semi-weaselly arguments, such as your clue-sifting intellect has been shifted from the background to the foreground. So now you are paying attention to the environment and it is giving you messages. And we all know that schizophrenics move into mental spaces where every license plate carries a message. And every headline is about them, and every conversation among the people they pass on the street is about them. But we all also know that we ourselves dabble with this, that this belief that the world is entirely independent of our minds and objective and unaware of us is the kind of scientific fiction in which we operate. And then the real truth that appears to our perceptions, the truth of our immediate experience, is that the mind is a concentric field of diminishing intensity that can draw events and circumstances far from the ranges of probability. Once I had the following experience. It's all anecdotal, you see. I was in a dry wash in the Negev desert, and there was absolutely no food, and I was a poor traveling hippie, a hashashin, and a cave dweller, and a ne'er-do-well, and it was like 120 degrees outside my cave, and I was sitting in front of my cave smoking hash, and out through the shimmering heat I could see this dot of a person, and as I watched them making their way through the rocks and the scrub, I began to have a fantasy about this person, that they had food, that they didn't simply have food, that they had oysters Rockefeller packed in ice, that they had Russian caviar, that they had Belgian chocolate, that they had all of this stuff. And, I hadn't had a bath in 3 weeks. There was barely any water in this place. And this speck made its way toward me, getting larger and larger. And finally, it turned into this guy I barely knew, a fellow lost soul. This was in southern Israel 25 years ago. And he came up to me and he said, I have oysters packed in ice. I have Belgian chocolate. And he had gotten a job dishwashing that morning at the King David Hotel and had just quit in disgust halfway through the day and had raided
this super fancy 4-star hotel and just had a backpack full of this stuff. And I didn't even bother to tell him. I mean, what am I going to say, you know? I mean, sure, of course. So these kinds of things, and they're very private, you see. Nothing happens there except that a guy quits his job and rips off a hotel, except that it is coincident with an internal state, a private musing of somebody else, and when the two things come together, the coincidence of it is absolutely excruciating. Kat had an experience. She's not here to tell it, but she went to Mexico when she was 19 and traveled all over Mexico and took LSD at a certain temple. And on the LSD trip in this place, she realized that she had been conceived there. And when she confronted her parents with it, it was so. It was so that she had been conceived there. Now, of course, you can say, well, in growing up, this must have been a story told around the dinner table, and then under LSD, the child brings it out. But sometimes these things just peels reality apart. The purest proof that I've ever had that goes against the clue-finding, integrative, unconscious thing, and really the time wave that we've spent so much time looking at, is in a sense a net to trail through life. It's a coincidental engine. It causes there to be more coincidences in your life. And in fact, a way to let coincidence in your life is to let numbers into your life. The schizophrenic who looks at the license plates passing on the freeway is simply the lowest grade worshiper of numbers. But when you really let numbers into your existence, coincidence runs rampant. We have talked here a little bit about the most astonishing coincidence of all, which is that mathematics describes nature. That's a coincidence as far as I can tell. Why should it? No philosopher that I have ever read, no mathematician, has ever been able to make cogent sense that the abstract operations of the human mind should somehow map over the core dynamics of nature. It's like a coincidence. When I was working with the time wave, the most perfect example of anticipation or disruption of ordinary flows of probability was I had this idea when I was working out the time wave. Before the 2012 date was chosen and settled on, way back in the early 70s, I discovered an odd coincidence, which went like this. It's embedded in a whole bunch of coincidences, but it goes like this. From the date of my mother's death till the time when I met the woman who went with me to La Chorrera, 64 days passed. From the time I met that woman till the actual experiment at La Chorrera, 64 days passed. From thence forward, 3 times 64 days later was my 23rd birthday. And looking at all these coincidences, I propagated forward into time, not 64-day increments, but 384-day increments. And I discovered something really interesting, which was when you went from my 23rd birthday, 384 days forward,
no particular big deal. But when you went 384 days forward again, it landed on the winter solstice of 1973. And I thought that this was mildly interesting. And so then I looked in a naval observatory almanac, and I discovered that there was a total eclipse of the sun on this solstice, which I thought was pretty weird, and that this total eclipse of the sun would sweep across the Amazon, would only be visible from the Amazon basin, would be approaching totality as it swept across La Chorrera, and it would in fact achieve totality over the city of Belém in Brazil. Well, now, Belém is a Portuguese word which means Bethlehem. And I began to feel led. I began to feel as though I were being fed clues. So then I looked at the map, and you may do so as well, and you will see that the city of Belém in Brazil, the city of Bethlehem, is situated in the delta of the Amazon. Well, I'm Joyce scholar and river freak enough to know that all rivers are female, and if you're too dense to know that, certainly the Amazon River is female, because it is named the Amazon. I mean, Gaia is what it is, you know, and Amazon is a giant woman. Well, here in her vulva, literally in the delta, and delta, you see, is this triangular, the Greek letter delta is a triangle and has been a schoolboy symbol for the female genitals for 18,000 years. In the delta of the Amazon sits the city of Belém, over which on a certain winter solstice a total eclipse of the sun will appear. And I said, no, my goodness, this is the stuff of prophecy. Something marvelous, it must be going to happen there. And, you know, you must know Yeats' poem, what's it called? The Second Coming, the one about what rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. And it is an apocalyptic image, an image of the shift of the aeon. So I had all this data, see, pointing at December 23rd, 1973. But I got this same argument from people, this argument that you must have known, you must have seen these astronomical ephemerides at some time in the past, you must have an unconscious photographic memory, the mind must be a computer at some level, and so forth and so on. But what clinched it for me was early in 1973, still 11 months before this much anticipated moment, I opened the San Francisco Chronicle one morning, and it says, long period comet headed toward Earth. And I closed the newspaper and said aloud, I know that this comet will make its closest approach to the sun on December 23rd. Then I open the paper and read it. It says, yes, it will approach perihelion on the 22nd of December, give or take, you know, so many hours Greenwich. And then I saw, for me, that did it, because what it was a perfect proof. My wish had been granted, because you see, no human being on Earth knew that this comet existed or had ever known, because it was a long period comet. It had never in historical times been in the skies of Earth. When I had focused in on this date using all these clues, it was absolutely in the value dark dimension. It was not in the collective unconscious, unless the collective unconscious anticipates the future. And if that's the case, then There's no way to contaminate any experiment from influence. So, the mushroom was willing enough to provide for my edification, this thing. Well, but then see what happens. You may remember this comet. It was the comet Kohoutek, and it was an excuse for all kinds of falderall. I mean, harmonic convergence, eat your heart out. This was a much bigger deal, and yet this comet, which physically should have blossomed out into the most spectacular comet of all human history, was a dud. And once again, prophets ate it right and left, and booksellers were left with vast unsold inventory. So to me, it's like play. It's like a joke. It's like if that doesn't seem like a joke to you, then you don't have a sense of humor. It's not going to hand over alchemical gold, because after all, why should it? Who are we to be the recipients of alchemical gold? But it does tease, and it does play. And I think if you're playful enough, you can coax it into being your playmate, and perhaps in these boundary dissolved states, this is what happens. I've told the story about how in the Amazon, when all this stuff was breaking loose, I went through this period where very calmly and deeply and without having any need to tell anyone, I thought, I came to the opinion that I was like enlightened. And it was this very low-key thing. It was all about appropriate behavior. This was the cognitive hallucination that I was having. It was about appropriate behavior. And I had this idea there's an appropriate way to do everything. And if you do it the appropriate way, no energy will be lost. And so you become like superconducting. You become like some kind of super Tai Chi character where you just do things so niftily that there's no problem, whether it's plucking a flower or moving a boulder. And I was told, when you think, sit on the ground. There were all these teachings, and they were very simple. They were things like, sit on the ground, stupid, and, use your fingers. That was a big teaching. Use your fingers. So one of the things I was into was how you wash the pot. We had one pot. It was this little enamel pot. And we would bake it over a fire, and we baked beans and we baked rice and all these terrible things that would get scum on the bottom. And so it was a big deal about drawing lots for who washed the pot. Well, I discovered in my enlightened state that we had been doing it all wrong. And that if you would go down to the water with the pot and take sand and pat it very, very lightly in the bottom, and then say, please, that then all you had to do was pour water into the pot and swish it around and empty it like that. And then when you looked in, it would be like Drano, it would just be blinding white. And I did this several times, and I thought how appropriate a miracle this is. This is a real miracle. I mean, this is just simple stuff. It's totally here and now. It's absolutely Taoist. It's completely, on and on. So then I had a critic in our crowd. And so I thought that I would enlighten the critic by a wordless demonstration of my obvious command of the howling Tao. So I invited the critic to accompany me to the river. And I said, and now notice that I pick up the sand, I pat it into the bottom, I'm not agitating it. I look into the sky and I say, please. And then I put water in it, and I swish it around. Voila!
They said, is something supposed to happen? And I look and the crud adheres. And then this person says, you know, I pity you. And I would pity you more, but you alarm me. This was the sequela to the thing with the dancing butterflies, which was at the same time and the same thing, which is in my enlightened state, totally master of the Tao, I would go into the woods and I would hold out my hands, my outstretched hands like this. And butterflies that I had hunted relentlessly for months with a 16-foot extendable Japanese killing machine that was my tool in trade, these canopy butterflies would come down and land on my hands and strut and show their iridescence, and tears of joy would stream down my face, and I would kneel down, and they would all line up in front of me, and then I would weep more, but you know, how much cathartic weeping and joy of this sort can you contain? So there would be this little nub in the experience which would begin to grow stronger, which was all about, this proves that I'm on to something. Nobody could look at this and not realize. Said, I must show someone. And the critic had not spoken to me since the pot washing incident, but was very, you know, on me. So then I went back to camp and I said, let's just take a walk down the trail. Maybe we can work out these differences, thinking that I wouldn't even mention it. I would just sort of, as I was consoling them, put out my hand and you know, butterflies would drop from the trees. They would realize the error of their ways, so forth and so on. Well, of course, you know, that didn't happen. So then I said, well, maybe I'm being too humble here. I should at least make a commitment to the thing. So I said, stand here and watch. And I raised up my hands to call the insects of the jungle to me. And then the line was delivered the second time, you know. I pity you. And you're not your word, you know. You're This is all true. It is true that the butterflies danced on the back of my hand. Well, so what is one to conclude from this? Well, I think what you have to conclude is that ego is the absolute impediment to Tao. And that if you care what other people think, if you care how it's going to impact on your reputation, if you have any of these lesser concerns, this power, this radiance, this dimension of authenticity can't approach you, you know? And we all have it. And I'm sure I have it more than most people. And yet even I am able to let down into these places where the world works magic, you know? And I think women and intuitive men and people who aren't quite as analytical as I may be are able to do it much more. And that is the real proof. You can talk about be here now till you're blue in the face, you know, but the real proof is when nature responds like that.
Appropriate behavior.
Well, no, I don't mean caring about others. I mean that if you are, I guess the sin is pride. The sin is pride. If it thrills you that you're enlightened, or if you're glad you beat out your competition, or if you want to display your accomplishment, then it's ruined, you know? It has to be held so very lightly, so very lightly. It cannot be shared, in a sense. Forget sharing it, because we're not pure enough to share it. It's amazing that we're pure enough to occasionally embody it, you know?
I've told you the story about sitting on the beach. It always happens when you're alone, because then you get no credit. You see, it's no credit to you, and you shouldn't get any credit. But sitting on a beach, I can't even remember the substance, but something like this, or maybe something like this, I'm not sure, but sitting on a beach, meditating, holding my hands like this, and in the middle of the meditation, I become aware of something like a bug, or something is on my hand, and it's like tickling me. And so I ignore it, and then, and then I come back to it, and then it feels fairly substantial. Maybe I should check this out. So then finally I open my eyes, and I look down, and there's a crab. And the crab is cleaning my fingernails. And the crab cleans all of my fingernails and then runs across my lap and cleans all of the fingernails on the other hand. Well, what this is just sitting still and letting nature be what it wants to be and letting it manifest its intentionality. We tear through and bust up and smash apart, and then we say, well, that was a nice hike in the woods. And always, if you will go into the forest and sit down, and it's about finding the time of the place. And in the time of the place, the magic is coming and going in a way that if you're moving faster or slower, it just isn't there. And I've often had experiences that I felt that were connected with psychedelics, but the main function of the psychedelic was to get me to be still for a long time. Kat had a wonderful experience on a Mexican pyramid. She was exploring it. She took LSD or something and fell asleep. And when she woke up, the tree she had been sleeping in, that she had been staring into the branches before she fell asleep, and so had a very clear picture of it. When she awakened, a very large snake had shed its skin directly above her in the branches of the trees. Well, part of this is the doorway into coincidence, but part of it is magical attunement with what wants to be. This is what I think Kay must have been indicating. This is not language. This is communication. This is, the breath of the Tao. And everything that we say betrays this. So feng shui, geomancy, an elaborate theory about energy flowing through the earth. As a verbal model, to me, quite unconvincing. As a set of feelings about the world, as a sense of the intentionality of place, incontrovertibly true.
Yes, well, some of you have probably read Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he shows, that it's never the way they tell it afterwards. The aftertelling is always about the primary insight, the careful experiment, the gathering of data, the correlation. Actually, it doesn't work like that at all. It's entirely psychic, piecemeal, ruled by synchronicity. One of the most interesting things, I'll tell this story and then we can go to lunch, because I think, science has great pretensions about itself. I mean, it basically regards itself as a meta-theory. It regards itself as capable of passing judgment on all other theories. They are supposed to submit themselves to science to be told whether they're real or not. Yeah, like a religion. Well, how many people know modern science was founded by René Descartes in the early 17th century. What were the circumstances under which Descartes founded modern science. René Descartes was a 19-year-old, basically ne'er-do-well, and he decided that he would go wenching and soldiering across Europe, which was a thing that young men of certain class did at that time. And so he joined a Habsburg army that was laying siege to Prague in the summer of 1619, and after they had taken care of the problem there in Prague, this Habsburg army began to retreat across southern Germany. And on the evening of, now there's a lot of arm wrestling about this, but let's just say the 17th of August, 1619, this army made camp near the little town of Ulm in southern Germany, which, synchronicity freaks, pay attention, Ulm will later be the birthplace of Albert Einstein. Worth noting. But that night, Descartes, in the barracks, had a dream. And an angel appeared to him, and the angel said, the conquest of nature is to be achieved through number and measurement. And he was thunderstruck. He took that angelic revelation and turned it into modern science. Modern science was founded by an angel. You know, they don't tell you this at MIT. It's astonishing how things which claim roots in rationalism are actually among some of the most irrational productions in the historical continuum. It appears that our development, our history, our histories have always been created at the promptings of invisible voices. I mean, Socrates, who is at the very center of what's called thinking by Western civilization, Socrates had a demon, D-E-A-M-O-N. It was a little voice. It was his crap detector. It told him the difference between profound philosophical thinking and bullpucky. And so, the edifice of Western thinking built on Platonism owes its debt to an invisible agency speaking from hyperspace. So does modern science a la Descartes. How much more of this? I mean, we don't care if artists talk to angels because our definition of them is that they're screwballs. But to believe that an enterprise like modern science has to trace its way back to the same ecstatic roots is, I think, very suggestive that the world is stranger than we can suppose, and that we need to open these channels of communication to these invisible worlds. Probably the next great paradigm shift will be enunciated by a mushroom, an angel, an elf, an alien, what have you. At the psychedelic dose level of these mushrooms, you get a very important quality, in fact, the centrally important quality for my argument, which any of you who have ever taken these things have experienced yourselves, and that's what I call boundary dissolution. And here's the notion in a nutshell. When you look back through the primate phylogeny, clear back to the primitive primates, the squirrel monkeys and those sorts of animals, there are always what are called male dominance hierarchies. There's an alpha male animal who, through brute force usually, takes the most desirable females under his command and sets his lieutenants his male lieutenants over the rest of the females. And this is how these monkey societies order themselves. Well, because psilocybin is a boundary dissolving hallucinogen, and because the essence of ego consciousness, which is necessary for these boundary hierarchies, for these dominance hierarchies, the essence of ego is boundary definition. So what I'm actually suggesting in this book is that we self-medicated ourselves into a state of gender equality and partnership, consciously or unconsciously, by allowing this item in our diet which suppressed ego and hence suppressed male dominance hierarchies. And so the ordinary momentum of primate evolution was interrupted. And for a period of about, who knows, pick a number, somewhere between 15 and 50,000 years, ending about 10,000 years ago, we actually lived in a kind of paradise where human beings were at equilibrium and in balance with the earth, where men and women were in balance with each other. And I should have mentioned this sexual arousal which went along with the mushroom taking promoted a style of orgy, probably at festivals which were lunar. At the new and full moon, everybody basically just jumped each other's bones in a big heap. And the social consequence of orgy as a social style is that it makes it impossible for men to trace lines of male paternity. This is very important. There is, in a society which practices orgy, no concept for men of my children. There is only the concept of our children, meaning the tribe, the group. So male loyalty goes toward the group. And this is very important because once men discovered male paternity, they discovered ownership of hunting grounds, food supplies, women, you name it. And it tended to feed back into the formation of the ego structure. Well, and so I believe that really that was the golden age of humanity, that we all long for and have a great poignancy for, that has even been called the nostalgia for paradise. I believe we have this nostalgia for paradise because we are the victims of a fall. You see, what happened was this African grassland environment, which was necessary for the ecology of the mushrooms, and therefore necessary to maintain this partnership paradise, eventually it all dried up. The Sahara turned to desert. These people were forced out of Africa into the ancient Middle East, and we fell into history. And this is the moment at which agriculture was invented. Agriculture, because you have to stay in one place and tend the crops and defend the surplus of these successful agricultural efforts, means the end to nomadism. It means the birth of cities. It means the creation through surpluses of classes of those who have and those who have not. It promotes kingship. It creates the need for standing armies. You can tell the drift here. All the institutions that we associate with male oppression, with hierarchy, with dominance, come into play at that point. So I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just in a nutshell, that situation is the situation in which we were born and came to consciousness. The paradisical situation of gender partnership that then dissolved. It was really a return back to the earlier primate style of male dominance and hierarchy when the mushroom was no longer available. We returned to our old monkey ways, and we have been
practicing those monkey ways ever since, even as we reach toward the sequencing of the human genome, the exploration of the solar system, the exploration of the heart of matter. Nevertheless, we do it from a psychologically damaged perspective. Now, the question of drugs. Why, as a species, are we so obsessed and so addictable to so many things? There are a few animals who will break into a compound for fermented fruit or something like that, but we addict to dozens of substances and behaviors. Well, I believe that you can make an analogy to a person who was abused or traumatized as a child. The entirety of human history has been acted out in the light of the traumatic severing of our connection into the Gaian mother goddess planetary matrix of organic wholeness that was the centerpiece of the psychedelic experience back in the high Paleolithic. In other words, the world of hallucination and vision that psilocybin carries you into is not your private unconscious or the architecture of your neural programming, but it is in fact a kind of intellect, a kind of being, a kind of Gaian mind. For Paleolithic human beings, it was the great goddess. Once you sever from this matrix of meaning, what James Joyce called the mama matrix most mysterious, once you sever yourself from that, then you have nothing but rationalism, ego, and male dominance to guide you. And that's what has led us into the nightmarish labyrinth of technical civilization, overpopulation, classism, racism, sexism, propaganda, so forth and so on. All the ills of modernity. So I wrote this book making this argument because I believe that if we could import into straight society, almost as a Trojan horse, the idea that these psychedelic compounds and plants are not aberrational, they are not pathological, they are not some minor subset of impossibility that only freaks and weirdos become involved with, but rather they are in fact the catalyst that called forth humanness out of animal nature. If we could entertain this as a possibility, it would change the way we think about so-called primitive societies, shamanism, the psychedelic experience, society's efforts to control and eradicate these substances. And I believe that we are really in a race on this planet now between education and disaster. And it is the momentum of the ego that threatens to shove us over the cliff into Armageddon. Famine, overpopulation, you can kiss goodbye to democratic values. We are all going to live in an Orwellian anthill if we don't, what? Change our minds. We have to change our minds on a dime. I'm not talking about a 500-year program to slowly straighten things out. We have, I believe, less than 30 years to come to terms with the dissolving ozone hole, the toxification of the oceans, the greenhouse effect, the spread of epidemic disease, the rise of fascism, the relentless efforts of the free marketeers to deal products in every corner of the planet. We must change our minds. And what we have to do is have recourse to these same shamanic plants and shamanic practices that allowed our remote ancestors to come to terms with the mystery of being and their situation on this planet vis-a-vis the rest of nature. So I think it's very important at this time to make this argument as clearly as possible, to launch the idea into society and let argument and debate rage. Now, you may think that I'm proposing blowing up some already existing edifice of theory about how human beings came to be. This is not the case. As a matter of fact, orthodox anthropology hasn't a clue. We are the fly in the soup of natural science's explanation of the evolution of species. It's easy to understand how one kind of hummingbird emerges from another. It's not very easy to understand how creatures that build something like Los Angeles can emerge out of creatures who hunt ants by sticking grass stems down their holes, you know. We represent some kind of primary break with nature at the animal level. And I believe it's because we have a symbiotic relationship with all of nature. We are wired for this. There are drug receptors in our brains, in our physical brains, that have been carried along for 1,000 generations without really being called into use. But now is the time. If we really believe that these things expand consciousness, then we must study them, use them, apply them, because it's the absence of consciousness that is creating a terminal crisis, not only for us as a species, but for every living thing on this planet. And I think the psychedelic experience is as much a part of being alive as sexuality, language, the things which fulfill us and give meaning to the human experience are left incomplete and impossible to assimilate if we don't place the capstone on the edifice of our being in the world. And the capstone on that edifice is our right, our obligation, and the privilege of dissolving our ordinary ego boundaries and merging with the mind and purpose of the planet. And this is what I was trying to say in the book, and this is what I hope I'm able to communicate to you this evening.
Very well.
Thank you very much.
Here's an amazing passage. People like to think people thought the world was flat until the Renaissance. This is an incredible psychedelic image of outer space that is 2nd century A.D. Would that it were possible for you to grow wings and soar into the air. Poised between earth and heaven, you might see the solid earth, the fluid sea and the streaming rivers, the wandering air, the penetrating fire, the courses of the stars, and the swiftness of the movement with which heaven encompasses all. What happiness were that, my son, to see all these borne along with one impulse, and to behold him who is unmoved, moving in all that moves, and him who is hidden, made manifest through his works. And it goes on and on. It's very readable. It's very literary. It's highly poetic. It's a celebration of nature. The notion of sin is completely absent, and it rings with a kind of confidence, a kind of joy that was completely completely running counter to the brimstone and damnation point of view of Christianity. Here's to me, a psychedelic passage. But he who presents all things to us through our senses, and thereby manifests himself through all things and in all things, and especially to those to whom he wills to manifest himself. Begin then, my son Tat, with a prayer to the Lord and Father, who alone is good. Pray that you may find favor with him, and that one ray of him, if only one, may flash into your mind, so that you may have power to grasp in thought that mighty being. For thought alone can see that which is hidden, inasmuch as thought itself is hidden from sight. And if even the thought which is within you is hidden from your sight, how can he, being in himself, be manifest to you through your bodily eyes? But if you have power to see with the eyes of the mind, then, my son, he will manifest himself to you. For the Lord manifests himself ungrudgingly through all the universe, and you can behold God's image with your eyes and lay hold on it with your hands. If you wish to see him, think on the sun, think on the course of the moon, think on the order of the stars. Who is it that maintains that order? The sun is the greatest of the gods in heaven. To him as to their king and overlord, and all the kings of heaven yield place. And yet this mighty God, greater than earth and sea, submits to having smaller stars circling above him. Who is it then, my son, that he always obeys with reverence and awe? Each of these stars, too, is confined by measured limits and has an appointed space to range in. Why do not all the stars in heaven run like and equal courses? Who is it that is assigned to each its place and marked out for each the extent of its course? And so forth. So it's a nature-oriented, celebratory, it glories in the exercise of the mind. It is not doctrinal. It is not pietistic. It is magical, psychedelic, expansive. And I'm not implying that they used psychedelic substances. The evidence for that is incredibly murky and hard to get at. And probably they didn't. I mean, one of the real tragedies of Western history is that Western Europe is so poor in psychoactive plants. I mean, had Western Europe stayed in touch with the mystery religions of ancient Greece, Christianity would never have been able to force its agenda to the degree that it did. I think you can make an argument that there were psychedelic mysteries in Europe, probably up until the time of the fall of Eleusis. Hermeticism is only one heterodox strain among many that were in existence in Europe in the late Roman period, and that then partially survived into the Dark Ages. I mean, you have Neoplatonism, which is a group of philosophers in the 3rd and 4th century, who Plotinus, Porphyry, Proclus, and that crowd, and they took Plato, the late Plato, and contorted that into a mystical doctrine of emanation. They were what are called emanationists. What this means is you start with, it's either called the One or the Unnameable or Brahman, Atman, or something like that, and then you have a series of declensions into more and more material and more multiplistic expressions of being. These Neoplatonists were emanationists, and their theories about how the universe is constructed have become sort of the unconscious basis of all later magical speculation. They are the people who brought the angels into the picture so intensely, because they were trying to create a descending hierarchy of being from the most high down to the most low. And angels, once set in place, became a real problem for Christianity, because they are not very easy to distinguish from the old stellar demons of paganism. Paganism was largely the belief that the power of the stars could be drawn down to earth through sympathetic magic, really, by setting up resonances in a ritual situation. You could draw the power of the stars down into your projects and your intentions. And the late Middle Ages was a period of intensely working out all the associations between minerals, colors, perfumes, plants, musical notes and styles, so that you could then bring together all these things for purposes of magical evocation. And if any of you are interested in this, the book to read, which will point you toward many other interesting books, is a wonderful book called Spiritual and Demonic Magic, from Ficino to Campanella. Some of you may remember Campanella. Hell of a fighter. Anyway. Hello? And in the Renaissance, over a period of about 3 generations, this became a real problem, because what starts out as angel magic ends up as out-and-out demonic conjuration. Something which I've noticed my 14-year-old son has an incredibly unhealthy interest in, which I did as well at his age. I hope it's not the family curse coming back. So I mentioned the dating error. It was Lactantius, who was one of the fathers of the early church, one of the patristic writers. That's that generation of theologians that followed Christ, who canonized the Christian religion. And he placed Hermes Trismegistus as older than Moses, older than Pythagoras, older than Plato. And then it wasn't until Marie Casaubon corrected that problem. See, we forget how the really transformative breakthrough that was represented for Western Europe by the recovery of all of this ancient literature. It had been completely lost. And also a misimpression that probably needs correcting is, I think most people who are not schooled in Western history think that the further back in time, the more quote-unquote superstitious people were. This isn't actually the case. It isn't a case of the further back in time you go, the more belief in demons, magical conjuration, and stuff like that you get. The 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries in Europe were periods of remarkable piety and intellectual cohesion. Of course, it was also some kind of a fascist nightmare. That's how they achieved it. They had stamped out paganism. They had pushed heresy and heterodox thinking to the very distant frontiers of the empire, of the Holy Roman Empire. And people were not superstitious, and people were not obsessed with horoscopes and conjuration and this sort of thing. Where that all began was or where it reached its culmination, is in the 16th century. The 16th century, the 1500s, it was the most magical, obsessed century in the last 10. And alchemy and conjuration and talismanic magic and sympathetic magic, all of these things flourished really not as a throwback, but as a kind of prelude to modern science. Modern science is an incredibly demonic enterprise. And we will see, as we discuss this stuff, that in a curious and rarely discussed way, the program, the agenda of magical dissidents in Europe have been entirely achieved by the forces of what we call modernity. It's simply that it has been done in an entirely secular metaphor. I mean, if you take even the trivial belief about alchemists, that they were concerned with changing lead into gold. Of course, that isn't what it was about, but there were plenty of con artists running around on the periphery of these deeper scenes who were claiming they could change lead into gold. Well, in the 20th century, we routinely change lead to gold. You do it with neutron bombardment in particle accelerators. And of course, it costs far more to do it than the worth of the gold that you get out. But that really wasn't the point, was it? It was to prove that it could be done. The dreams of creating the homunculus are dreams that dovetail directly into the aspirations of modern biology, genetics, so forth and so on. The great chain of being of Aristotle is animated, given a dimension of motion, and lo and behold, it becomes the Darwin-Wallace theory of evolution. Merciliade talks about this, about how all the alchemical dreams of the 15th and 16th century have been brought to fruition in the 20th century. But again, in the absence of magical rhetoric, but certainly in a spirit of magical and Faustian recklessness, for sure. I mean, this is scientists, they claim such a devotion to truth that decency must never stand in the way because they serve a higher God than human values. They serve the golem of the truth in some weird way that makes the truth okay even if it kills you. I studied philosophy from Paul Feyerabend, and he used to say at the beginning of his Epistemology 101 course, I will teach you to recognize the truth, and I will teach you to ask the question, what's so great about it? So now you've got the truth, so what's so great about it? It was 1460 when these manuscripts were brought to Florence. Those of you with photographic memories can see the time wave signature as it turns over and heads through the floor. Cosimo de' Medici immediately ordered Ficino to abandon his work on Plato, and the Pymander, which was one of these books, it was the only one which existed in Europe, even in partial form during the Dark Ages. Cosimo died in 1464, but the translation project went forward, and just so you understand, the developmental process in Western magic all goes back to this Florentine translation project. And from there, people who were well-placed got a hold of this stuff. The most important person probably being a person, certainly an unsung hero in the development of Western thought, Trithemius, Bishop of Sponheim. And Trithemius wrote a book. It was really a manuscript. It was never printed as a book in his lifetime, but later, called the Stenographica. And in it, he put forth many of these magical doctrines and also encryption methods for code making and breaking so that this stuff could be circulated under the eyes of the clergy without causing a problem. And then the development of Western magic splits into two strains. The Bruno strain, Giordano Bruno. I understand he's running for President of the United States this year. Giordano Bruno and his school, he was a Franciscan monk who ended up being burned at the stake. His sin for which he was burned at the stake was he was sitting on a rooftop of one of these Italian city-states one evening, presumably smoking some pretty decent boo that they'd brought in from North Africa, and he was looking at the stars, and it occurred to him, these things are suns. These little points of light are like the sun. Jesus Christ! And in a single moment, the universe became infinite. And he said, if these are suns, and he just, his mind was boggled, literally. I mean, can you imagine inside the medieval worldview where they have these concentric shells of angels and demons and all this? Suddenly this guy gets it in a single moment, and he sees that the universe is infinite, and he begins to say so. And this is against Aristotle. And the church just goes nuts, and they drive him out of Italy, and he has a whole bunch of adventures in England and other places. Eventually he makes the mistake of coming back to a place in northern Italy where he's betrayed by his patron, and he's burned at the stake for a point of view which all of us take quite for granted. The other strain of magic coming down from Trithemius is the D strain. And it is a bit more accessible to people like ourselves because John Dee was an Englishman and he wrote in English. And so you don't have to conquer 16th century Italian or late Latin in order to read him, although he wrote a lot in Latin as well. Dee is a very interesting character, worth spending some time on, because Dee is the last person to be able to unify into one worldview science and mathematics and magic and astrology all together. So he is the greatest magician of his age and the greatest scientist of his age. He designed the navigation instruments that Sir Francis Drake used to go around the Cape Horn and sail up the coast of California. He was an intelligence operative serving Queen Elizabeth on the European continent. He could cast the best horoscope in Europe, and that was his entree into these various royal families of these various capital cities of Europe. And then he was, making maps of battlements and of the deployment of wharf facilities and shipbuilding capacity and stuff like that, and sending it all back to Elizabeth in these codes that he had learned from Trithemius, not personally, but from the Stenographica. And Dee, a very strange incident happened, which was on a cold day in April at his house in Mortlake, which is on the outskirts of London. Now it's completely surrounded by modern London. I should say, he had the largest library in England. He had 6,000 books.
Sir Philip Sidney and the Queen would occasionally call upon him to shoot the bull. And he was a very learned man. So one day in April of 1582, he's working at his desk at his room in Mortlake, and he goes outside. There's some disturbance in the garden, and he goes outside. And his story, and we have only his story, is that an angel descended in a ball of light and gave him an object which is to this day on exhibit in the British Museum. If you ever have a chance, it's worth hunting it down. It's in the Renaissance Hall, and it's a piece of black polished obsidian, roughly about this big and about that thick and very highly polished. He called it the Shew Stone, S-H-E-W. And what the deal was you could look into the Shew Stone if you had the right talent, and it was a magical theater. There were gods and demons and female spirits and all kinds of things swirling around this thing. Well, for the next many years, the Shew Stone was the major guiding force on Dee's life. And a guy came to him named Edward Kelly. And Edward Kelly, legend has it that he had no ears, which in England at that time meant that you had committed some infraction in the province and they had removed your ears. It was the mark of a con artist. So you couldn't fool anybody else. They took your ears off. So then if you met somebody with no ears and a big scheme, you knew to keep your wallet in your pocket.
You're describing consciousness of our consciousness as being in need of a lack of individuation.
Well, it's the issue between individuation and ego. And I think your question implies a confusion of the two. I mean, we glory in our individuality, our uniqueness, our specialness. But the ego is something else. The ego is something which seeks to actually empower itself at the expense of other people. And so, there has to be a trade-off. I think the glory of Western civilization is our empowering of our uniqueness, the unique artistic vision, the unique scientific vision. The appalling thing about Western civilization is how we have, taken the worst aspects of dominator society and institutionalized it, and then passed laws which make it almost impossible to overturn it. So I'm not preaching any form of anthill, fascist or communist or otherwise, but I do think, that we over-identify ourselves with things. We over-identify our happiness with objects. One of the great things about psychedelics that is so corrosive to capitalistic values is that psychedelics show you that the best stuff is in your own head. Better than walking down Madison Avenue looking in the windows is sitting in your shabby apartment on 6 dried grams looking in the windows.
You talk about a transcendental object.
Well, obviously the world arrives at the surface of your skin as one thing, and then it enters into perceptual channels of distinction. The eyes bring you some data, the ears bring you data, and the idea is that within the brain all these channels are supposed to be recombined to give you the original input. And apparently this is a culturally defined undertaking. In other words, when you think, you think you're thinking the way people have always thought. But in fact, how people think is very much dependent on media and informational biases in the society in which they were raised. I believe most Western people hear themselves think. In other words, they hear the equivalent of a voice speaking in their head, and it speaks their thoughts. When you smoke halfway decent pot or take psychedelics or something like that, you become aware that the processing of incoming audio data shifts slightly toward the visual, and you see what people mean, or their speech seems more colorful. It seems to convey more. And I think whether we process incoming speech by the ear or by the eye internally is a cultural piece of cultural conditioning, and that in fact we are in the act of changing over. That, this generation of young people who are always dissed as illiterate are in fact print illiterate, but they know more about electronic literacy than the people who are knocking them, and their bias is primarily toward the eye rather than the ear. That's why what we really have are two cultures talking past each other. And I think that psychedelics sort of strip out culturally conditioned styles of sensory processing, and that what we call hallucinations are nothing more than our thoughts beheld to some degree, and that we're not used to beholding our thoughts. We're used to hearing our thoughts. Yeah. Are nothing more than our thoughts beheld to some degree, and that we're not used to beholding our thoughts. We're used to hearing our thoughts. Yeah. The question is, talk about time speeding up. Maybe we're experiencing the rapture right now. Well, in a sense, that's what I was hinting at. History is a very low-volume version of the rapture. And the 20th century is a slightly higher volume of the rapture. And, the year preceding concrescence will be yet more like the rapture, and the minutes preceding concrescence, probably it will be the rapture. The universe is seeking some kind of completion at a very, very rapid state, and clearly technology is now what is driving it. For a long time it was driven by chemistry, and then 1.3 billion years ago it began to be driven by genetics. Biology became the carrier of change on this planet. 20,000 years ago, it moved into what some people call the epigenetic domain. That means change not in the genes. Writing is an epigenetic behavior. Language is an epigenetic behavior. Painting, dance, language, possibly borderline, quasi-genetic, quasi-epigenetic, as Chomsky implied. The thing that we're not coming to terms with, because it's almost literally, it's unthinkable, is that history is a birthing process. History is a very dramatic, painful, sudden episode where you begin at the top of the birth canal and you're a cheerful nomad herding your cattle across the African plains, worshiping a mother goddess, having your orgies, having your intoxication, so forth and so on. That's us at the top of the birth canal 18, 17, 16,000 years ago. Now, we are at the narrow neck, and we feel like we're being squeezed to death, suffocated. There is not enough water, there is not enough air, there is only pressure, 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 pressure. And how, in this moment of cumulative global crisis, can we imagine that this is simply a passage to a wider domain of being, as different from the world we have known as this world is from the amniotic oceans of the womb. But humanness survives. I mean, humanness is fully present in the womb, fully present in the world, makes the transition through the narrow neck of the birth canal, and we will make the transition, I am confident, through the narrow neck of modern history and into this wider post-historical domain. How much of our foolishness, our religions, our prejudices, our habits we will be able to take with us into that new domain, we don't know. We'll be lucky if we get to keep the body. And I'm for that, but I'm also completely aware it may not go according to my wishes. There may come a moment when there are levels of surrender that are trying to the most crazed among us. But nature is clearly now in the third and final act of her love affair with complexity. And our cultures, our technologies now have such a momentum for the production of this kind of complexity that political decisions hardly matter anymore. That's become a sideshow, and driven by money and scientific understanding, technology has taken the lead. And by technology, I don't mean simply machines. I use McLuhan's definition. Technology is simply the extensions of man. The extensions of man. We are hardwiring the unconscious. We are shrinking the planet to a point. We are democratizing the availability of data. We are digitalizing our past so that it doesn't decay, and we are triangulating and anticipating our future and discovering it as we live into it to be more fun than we ever dared imagine, more psychedelic than we ever dared imagine. And I look for this to continue until it just reaches excruciating levels. You put it very well. We are in the shadow of the rapture that is the end of history. And this is the end of this little get-together. Thank you very much.